The letter arrived on a cold, windless afternoon, bearing the mark of a house Catherine thought she had long forgotten. Its seal, an embossed crest of a coiled serpent wrapped around a crumbling tower, was unfamiliar, yet something about it stirred a distant memory. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the thick parchment, hesitant to open it. Who could be writing to her from Ashwick Manor, a place she had only heard whispered about in childhood stories, a name half lost in the haze of family legends? Curiosity, stronger than her unease, urged her fingers to break the seal. The letter inside was brief, written in a formal, almost archaic hand. To Miss Catherine Ashwick, we regret to inform you of the passing of your distant cousin, Lord Jonathan Ashwick, the last direct heir to Ashwick Manor. As per his will, the estate has been left in your care, as you are the closest living relative. We invite you to the reading of the will and suggest you come at your earliest convenience. Do note that the estate is in need of immediate attention. Ashwick Manor is your inheritance, but it is not without its burdens. A word of caution. No one has stayed within its walls overnight in over 30 years. Proceed with care. Sincerely, Harold Fairbanks, ESQ. Solicitor to the Ashwick estate. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she set the letter down. Ashwick Manor, the name alone conjured vague recollections of family tales, none of them pleasant. Her mother used to speak of it in hushed tones, her eyes darkening when the subject arose. A cursed place, her mother had said, a house that swallows people whole. But Catherine had always chalked it up to superstition, nothing more than a fanciful story to keep her away from a crumbling, forgotten relic of a house. Now, it was hers. For a moment, she considered throwing the letter away, pretending it had never arrived. What could she possibly want with an ancient manor in the middle of nowhere? But something, some deep-seated compulsion, wouldn't let her turn away so easily. There was a pull, a whisper at the edges of her mind, a voice calling her home. 2 days later, she found herself standing at the gates of Ashwick Manor. The once grand estate loomed before her, its towering stone facade draped in creeping ivy and shadowed by skeletal trees that clawed at the overcast sky. A chill crept up her spine as she took in the sight. The manor seemed almost alive, watching her approach with a silent, brooding malice. The iron gates swung open with an eerie groan, as if some unseen force had anticipated her arrival. Catherine hesitated but pressed on, gravel crunching beneath her feet as she walked the overgrown path leading to the front door. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional rustle of dead leaves underfoot. She reached the door, its wood darkened by age and rot, and found it unlocked. With a creak that echoed through the silent grounds, it opened easily, almost too easily. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her with a heavy thud. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of damp wood. The grand foyer was vast, its high ceilings disappearing into shadow, and the walls were lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. A shiver of unease slithered down her spine. As she stood there, adjusting to the oppressive silence, she heard it for the first time. A faint sound, barely more than a sigh. A whisper. Catherine froze, her breath catching in her throat. It came again, clearer this time, a soft, almost coaxing murmur. The sound seemed to come from the very walls themselves, as though the house was waking from a long, deep slumber. She turned, eyes scanning the dim hallway that stretched out before her. The whispering continued, growing fainter, elusive, like a conversation just out of reach. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she took a step back toward the door, only to find it locked. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, Catherine stood there, her pulse racing, straining to hear anything beyond the silence. But the house had gone still again, its secrets buried deep within the stone. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. And though she had only just arrived, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the manor had been waiting for her. And it was not finished whispering yet. Morning light filtered through the grime-streaked windows of Ashwick Manor, casting pale beams across the dust-covered floor. Catherine awoke in one of the few rooms that still seemed inhabitable, a small bedroom tucked away in the manor's east wing. The night had passed in a restless haze, the unsettling whisper from the foyer lingering in her thoughts, too real to dismiss as a figment of exhaustion. The house was silent now, but it didn't feel empty. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind slipping through the cracks in the old walls made her feel as though she wasn't alone. There was something unseen here, lurking just out of sight. Catherine dressed quickly, her fingers trembling as she buttoned her coat. The musty smell of the manor clung to everything, and though she tried to shake off the previous night's unease, a strange compulsion gripped her, a need to explore, to uncover the secrets hidden within these ancient walls. She stepped out into the hallway, its dimly lit corridor stretching out like a tunnel of shadows. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet as she walked, each step stirring up dust that lingered in the air like ghosts. The portraits on the walls, once noble and imposing, now stared down at her with hollow eyes, their faces faded and cracked by time. As she wandered deeper into the house, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The whispers from the night before had gone, but there was a new presence now, something in the very bones of the manor that seemed to breathe with her. It was as if the house had absorbed years of secrets and tragedies, and now, bit by bit, it was ready to let them slip out. She paused in front of a large wooden door at the end of the hall. It was carved with intricate details, worn smooth by countless hands over the centuries. Catherine hesitated before pushing it open, a wave of stale air rushing out to greet her. Inside was a sitting room, its faded furniture draped in sheets. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with forgotten books, dusty trinkets, and framed photographs. As she stepped inside, something whispered, this time clearer than before. Her breath caught, and she spun around, scanning the room. There was no one. The whisper came again, softer, like a half-remembered lullaby. Catherine swallowed hard and moved toward the shelves, her eyes drawn to an old photograph. She brushed the dust from its glass surface and peered closer. The image was of a family, stern-faced and dressed in the stiff, formal clothing of another era. A tall man, a woman at his side, and a little girl standing between them. Something about their eyes unsettled her. They were looking at the camera, yet their expressions were lifeless, hollow, as if they had already seen something unspeakable. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, and the photograph slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. As it shattered, the whispering intensified, a low murmur rippling through the air. She gasped, stepping back from the shards of glass, her heart hammering in her chest. The voices rose and fell, overlapping one another, as though the walls themselves were remembering conversations from long ago. Catherine strained to make sense of them, catching disjointed phrases, fragments of words that faded just as quickly as they appeared. The child. They never found her. Can't leave. Her pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to swirl around her, filling the room with a palpable sense of dread. Catherine backed toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, a voice cut through the others, distinct and chilling in its clarity. Catherine. Her name. It wasn't possible, but she had heard it. The house had spoken to her. She stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers fell silent again, leaving only the echo of her name hanging in the air like a curse. For a long moment she stood there, her back pressed against the door, trying to steady her racing heart. The silence was deafening, oppressive, as though the house had returned to its patient watching, waiting for her to ask the questions it was all too eager to answer. Catherine straightened, determined not to be cowed by shadows and whispers. There was something in this house, something it wanted her to find. And whatever it was tied to her family, to her very blood. But the house was warning her too. Ashwick Manor held its secrets close, and it wasn't going to give them up without a fight. The day passed in a haze of mounting tension. Catherine explored the rest of the manor, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, just beyond her sight. The whispering had faded into a distant hum, barely perceptible, but it still hung in the air like a heavy fog. She wasn't alone in this house. Every step she took felt watched, measured by some unseen force. By late afternoon, she found herself in front of a door unlike any of the others. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor, half hidden behind layers of cobwebs and dust. The thick wooden door bore a heavy iron lock, the keyhole rusted with age. This room had clearly been sealed for years, perhaps decades. Catherine's fingers grazed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock, cold and unyielding, seemed to resist even the thought of being opened. As she stood there, staring at the door, the faint murmur of whispers began to rise again, this time from somewhere deep within the walls. "Don't. You shouldn't. Leave it alone." The voices seemed almost pleading, warning her to stay away. But she had come too far now to turn back. She wasn't a child to be frightened by ghostly warnings and unseen presences. Something about this room called to her with an irresistible pull, a compulsion that felt less like curiosity and more like fate. This was where the answers lay. She was certain of it. Determined, she scoured the manor for a way to open the door. It wasn't until she ventured into the basement, a damp, claustrophobic space filled with broken furniture and forgotten relics, that she found it. Hidden behind a pile of rotting crates was an old key, large and ornate, its iron tarnished but still solid. The moment she touched it, the whispers erupted again, louder than before, overlapping in frantic bursts. Don't let it out. The room is cursed. You'll never escape." Catherine's heart pounded, but she ignored the voices. With the key clutched tightly in her hand, she made her way back upstairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. As she stood once more before the locked door, she hesitated only for a moment before sliding the key into the ancient lock. It turned with a harsh, grinding sound like metal against bone. The door swung open with a groan, releasing a rush of stale, cold air that smelled faintly of mildew and something else. Something rotten. The room inside was small, almost claustrophobic, lit only by the dim light filtering through a single dirty window. The furniture was sparse. A bed, a dresser, a mirror, all covered in a thick layer of dust. But it wasn't the room itself that made her blood run cold. It was the feeling. The air here felt different, heavier, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. And the whispers, which had been rising and falling like distant waves, suddenly went silent. The room was thick with a silence that felt unnatural, as though something had been waiting for her. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw something etched into the walls. Names, scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting. Dozens of names, some of them half erased by time, others still sharp and clear. They covered every inch of the walls, as though the room itself had become a diary for those trapped within it. At the center of the far wall was a name she recognized: Amelia Ashwick. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Amelia had been her great aunt, a woman spoken of in hushed whispers at family gatherings. She had disappeared as a child, vanishing without a trace, her fate a mystery that had haunted the Ashwick family for generations. Suddenly, the whispering returned, low and menacing. "She's still here. The room took her. You're next!" Catherine's gaze darted around the room, panic bubbling up inside her. She moved toward the dresser, her hand trembling as she opened the top drawer. Inside was a single object, a small, weathered doll, its glass eyes cracked and lifeless. The doll looked handmade, its stitched mouth twisted into an eerie, knowing smile. A memory stirred in Catherine's mind, a fragment of something her mother had once said. Amelia had a doll she carried everywhere, one that disappeared with her. She stepped back, her pulse quickening as the room seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, and the walls began to whisper again, this time louder, angrier. "You should have left. You shouldn't have opened it. She never left." The room felt alive now, the air thick with a malevolent presence. Shadows flickered in the corners, and the names on the walls seemed to writhe and shift. Catherine's mind screamed at her to leave, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut, and the whispers, growing louder, seemed to whisper just one final word: trapped. Night fell quickly over Ashwick Manor, as though the house itself swallowed the light. The heavy drapes in every room seemed to suffocate the last of the day's warmth, leaving Catherine shivering in the dark. She hadn't realized how much time had passed in the locked room, nor how far the darkness had crept. Now, the house felt different, alive in a way it hadn't before. Every corner was draped in shadow, and the whispers no longer lingered at the edge of her hearing. They had retreated, leaving behind a suffocating silence that felt worse somehow. It was the quiet before something terrible. Catherine gripped the old brass candlestick she had found in one of the bedrooms. The small flame flickered in the drafty hallway as she made her way through the manor, trying to find her bearings. The shadows moved with her, shifting and growing longer, as though they were watching, waiting. She reached the main staircase and paused. The foyer below stretched out like a cavern, the dim light barely touching the edges of the room. The front door, which she had locked and bolted herself, stood just out of sight around the corner. For a moment she considered leaving, just turning her back on the house and walking away. But something held her here, some part of her that needed to understand what had happened in this house, to her great Aunt Amelia, and to the other names carved into that dreadful room. She turned away from the stairs and moved deeper into the second-floor corridor. The whispers, though gone, had left behind an unsettling energy that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The house was waiting. As she passed by a large mirror in one of the hallways, something caught her eye. Catherine froze, her pulse quickening as she saw movement in the reflection. A shadow, longer than her own, rippled behind her. She spun around, heart in her throat, but the corridor was empty. The candle flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Catherine's breath quickened as she stared into the mirror, waiting. There it was again, a figure tall and gaunt, standing just at the edge of her vision, barely more than a silhouette in the dim light. She gasped and turned around again, her candle held high, but the figure was gone. The hallway was as empty as it had been a moment before. Her chest tightened, fear coiling in her stomach. She wasn't alone in this house. but whatever was with her didn't need to follow the same rules of space and time. The temperature dropped further as she continued down the corridor, her breath fogging in front of her. With each step, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker, as though the house itself were closing in on her. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the walls in ways that didn't make sense, reverberating as though the house had more space than it should. Suddenly, the whispers returned, sharp and urgent, cutting through the silence. "Behind you. Run. Too late." Catherine's blood froze. She turned, candlelight flickering wildly, casting twisted shadows across the walls. For a moment she saw it clearly, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It was indistinct, like a shadow made solid, its form barely human. It stood unnaturally still, but the air around it seemed to pulse, as if it were drawing strength from the darkness. She took a step back, and the figure began to move, its footsteps silent but deliberate, closing the distance between them with unnatural speed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Don't let it touch you. It's coming." Catherine turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she raced down the hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch out in front of her, twisting and curling like fingers trying to grab hold. She could feel the presence behind her, growing closer with every step. The air around her thickened, pressing down on her like a weight, slowing her movements. She reached the staircase and stumbled down the steps, the candle slipping from her grasp and snuffing out as it clattered to the floor. Darkness engulfed her completely. Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled in the dark, desperate to find something, anything that would guide her through the pitch-black void. Then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. She stumbled backward, her hands finding the wall, cold and damp beneath her fingers. The breathing grew louder, filling the space around her, a rasping, unnatural sound that made her skin crawl. Then the whispers returned, louder than ever, almost deafening. "It's here. Run! Run! You can't escape!" The shadows seemed to press in from all sides, and she could feel the figure behind her, the air turning colder with every breath she took. Her body felt frozen in place, terror rooting her to the spot as the darkness closed in. Just as the panic threatened to overwhelm her, a door at the far end of the foyer slammed open, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. In the sudden rush of noise, Catherine bolted, her legs carrying her through the dark hall toward the open door. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. The presence was still there, chasing her, its shadow stretching out to claim her. She reached the door, slamming it shut behind her, and the whispers stopped abruptly. She collapsed against the door, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her ears. For a moment the house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But Catherine knew better now. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and whatever lurked within its walls was hunting her. And it wasn't finished yet. The door slammed behind Catherine with a force that rattled the floor beneath her feet. She collapsed against it, gasping for breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. The house had gone still again, but it was the kind of stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She wasn't safe. She knew that much now. Whatever haunted Ashwick Manor had chased her out of the upper floors, but it hadn't given up. It was waiting. She had escaped the shadows for now, but the whispers had led her somewhere far worse. The basement. The air here was thick and damp, the smell of earth and rot seeping into her lungs with each breath. The walls were stone, rough and cold, and the ceiling was low, making the space feel more like a tomb than a basement. The stairs behind her, narrow and winding, vanished into the darkness above. She didn't dare go back up. There was something alive in the house, something that had chased her, and the thought of facing it again made her chest tighten with fear. The basement was vast, a maze of crumbling stone walls and twisting passageways. The darkness here felt different from the shadows above. It was denser, like the very air had been soaked in centuries of fear and anguish. Somewhere deep in this place, she knew, was the answer. The whispers had lured her here, guiding her away from the thing that had nearly caught her upstairs. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking straight into something even worse. As she moved through the narrow corridors, the walls seemed to close in, the stone pressing against her on either side. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls in strange, distorted patterns. She wasn't sure if the whispers had stopped, or if they were simply muffled by the thick stone that surrounded her. But something was down here with her, something ancient and buried. She could feel it in the very air she breathed. After what felt like hours of wandering through the labyrinthine tunnels, Catherine came upon a door, half hidden in the shadows at the end of a narrow passage. It was old, far older than the rest of the house, and its wood was cracked and blackened with age. An iron latch, rusted but still functional, held it shut. Her hand hovered over the latch, trembling. She knew deep down that whatever was behind this door had been hidden for a reason. The whispers had warned her. The shadows had tried to stop her, but she was too far in now. There was no turning back. With a shaky breath, she pulled the latch. The door creaked open, releasing a blast of cold, damp air that smelled of decay. Beyond the door was a cavernous chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was stone, slick and uneven, and at the center of the room was a large pit surrounded by crumbling bricks. Chains, rusted and broken, hung from the walls, and old, tattered rags lay scattered around the edges of the pit, remnants of those who had been trapped here before. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They swirled around her, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words sharp and frantic. Don't look down. They buried it here. It will pull you in. You can't escape. Catherine edged closer to the pit, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel a cold wind rising from its depths, carrying with it the stench of rot and something far worse. Something that made her stomach turn. The walls seemed to close in on her again, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive. A voice, clearer than the others, cut through the chaos. It was sharp and full of pain, but unmistakably human. Catherine, help me. She froze. That voice. It was her great Aunt Amelia's. The pit seemed to shift, the air rippling around it as though it were breathing. Catherine felt an overwhelming pull toward the edge, as if some unseen force was urging her to look inside, to see what lay at the bottom. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her closer to the dark void. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, screaming at her to stop. But it was too late. Catherine looked down, and what she saw nearly made her collapse in terror. The pit was impossibly deep, its bottom swallowed in shadows. But there, halfway down, were the faces of the dead. Twisted and contorted, they stared up at her with hollow eyes, their mouths open in silent screams. Their bodies were bound in chains, their limbs tangled together in an eternal struggle. And at the very center of them all, her great Aunt Amelia. Her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto Catherine's, and her lips moved again, whispering the same words. Help me. Catherine stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. Her legs felt like lead, her body trembling as the faces in the pit began to shift and move, reaching for her with ghostly hands. The voices were deafening now, screaming, pleading. "You'll never leave. It's coming for you. Join us." Something in the pit stirred, rising from the darkness. A shadow, larger and more terrifying than anything she had seen in the house. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was suffocating. A blackness that seemed to consume the very air around it. Catherine turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest, the voices chasing her as she fled through the basement corridors. The walls seemed to twist and shift around her, the darkness pressing in on all sides. She didn't stop until she reached the stairs, her legs shaking as she ascended back into the house. But the whispers followed her, and deep beneath the manor the pit waited, hungry and patient. It would wait forever if it had to. Catherine barely made it out of the basement. Her legs trembled, and every breath felt like it dragged razor blades into her lungs. The manor had gone deathly silent again, but the silence was worse than the whispers. It was filled with anticipation, a pause before the house delivered its final blow. She slammed the basement door shut behind her, throwing the bolt across it as if that could stop whatever nightmare lay beneath. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the basement that held the key to Ashwick Manor's curse. The answers were above, where the house had kept its darkest secrets hidden in plain sight. Catherine stood in the entry hall, her thoughts racing, her body numb from fear. She had seen the pit, seen her great Aunt Amelia's face twisted in terror, along with the countless other souls trapped in its depths. But what had started it? What had brought this ancient evil into her family's home? She knew now that it wasn't just about the past. It was about her. The house wanted her too. Her eyes drifted toward the grand staircase, and suddenly, she felt the pull again. Stronger this time, almost undeniable. It came from the top floor, a presence so powerful she could feel it thrumming in her bones. The whispers were gone, but their absence felt intentional, as if the house was giving her a final choice, to face the truth, or to run. But there was no running. Not anymore. With shaking hands, Catherine gripped the banister and ascended the stairs. Her footsteps echoed hollowly in the vast, empty space. The portraits on the walls seemed to leer at her, their eyes glinting in the dim light, and she half expected one of them to speak. But they remained silent, their grim expressions frozen in place. At the top of the stairs, she found herself standing in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was plain, unremarkable, but something about it radiated a sense of finality. This was where it ended. The door was slightly ajar, and Catherine pushed it open, her breath catching in her throat as she stepped inside. The room was unlike any other in the manor. It was small, almost cozy, but there was something off about it. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the furniture, though dusty, was still arranged as though someone had lived there recently. In the center of the room stood a writing desk, papers strewn across it, a candle burnt down to a stub beside them, and there, sitting at the desk, was a figure. Catherine froze. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her presence. It was a man, his back to her, hunched over the desk as though deep in thought. She could hear the faint scratch of a quill moving across parchment, though the candle beside him had long since died. "Who are you?" Catherine's voice came out in a whisper, barely audible in the heavy silence of the room. The figure didn't respond. Slowly, she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the man's back. His clothes were old-fashioned, tattered at the edges, and his skin, pale and paper-thin, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Jonathan Ashwick," she breathed, realization dawning on her. The last true heir of Ashwick Manor, her distant cousin, the one whose death had brought her here. But why? Why was he still here, trapped in this room? As she reached out to touch his shoulder, the figure suddenly turned, his face contorted in a grotesque mask of horror. His eyes were wide, lifeless, and his mouth hung open, as though frozen mid-scream. Catherine staggered back, her heart leaping into her throat. Then the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a deafening roar. "He's not the last! It's you! You have to take his place!" The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick and suffocating. Jonathan's face, still locked in its eternal scream, flickered and shifted, his form dissolving into shadows. The papers on the desk swirled into the air, whipped by an unseen force, and a sudden sharp pain lanced through Catherine's chest. She clutched at her heart, gasping as the realization struck her like a blow. The house had never wanted Jonathan. It had never wanted any of the Ashwicks who came before her. It had been waiting for her. The whispers, now clear, spoke in unison. The blood of the last Ashwick. Catherine staggered to the desk, her eyes falling on the papers scattered across it. They were letters. Frantic, desperate letters written by Jonathan in the final days before his death. They spoke of the curse, of a dark pact made centuries ago, one that demanded a blood sacrifice. The pit beneath the house, the thing that lurked in its depths, was bound to the Ashwick line, feeding on their souls one by one. But Catherine's name wasn't just on the letters. It was on the walls, carved in jagged lines, written over and over again. Her fate had been sealed long before she ever set foot in Ashwick Manor. Suddenly, the shadows in the room twisted and surged, reaching for her with long, grasping fingers. The air grew colder, and the darkness swirled around her, wrapping itself around her body like a vice. She felt her strength ebbing away, her vision dimming as the house claimed her, just as it had claimed Amelia, Jonathan, and all the others. In her last moments, Catherine understood. Ashwick Manor was alive, a prison for the souls of her family, and she was its final prisoner. The last Ashwick, the sacrifice it had been waiting for. And now, the whispers would never stop. Not for her. Not for anyone. The house had won.